Good morning, students. Today we will talk about the remaining portion of the anatomy of the third ventricle. In the previous lecture, we had seen what exactly is the third ventricle, uh, what part of the brain it belongs to. We had seen what other cavities or structures it is communicated with. We had also seen the various types of recesses formed due to extension of this cavity, and we had talked about its anterior as well as posterior wall. Today we will talk about the remaining boundaries, the remaining structures that form its roof floor and the lateral medial walls, and we'll also discuss about the clinical significance related with the third ventricle. Now this structure here is basically the fornix. Fornix is a C-shaped bundle of nerve fibers, and in this figure you can see the various parts, the body, the columns of the fornix. This figure also tries to show the same, the corpus callosum, then the septum pellucidum, and then the fornix. And it is also showing the anterior commissure, which is related to the fornix. Now this figure here, uh, in the previous lecture we had talked about the anterior wall and the posterior wall. Now in this figure you can see those structures. You can see the lamina terminalis here. This is the lamina terminalis. Then you can see the anterior commissure, and this is the anterior column of the fornix. So these three structures form the anterior wall of this third ventricle. And you can also see the posterior wall here is formed by the pineal gland. It is formed by the posterior commissure, and it is formed by the cerebral aqueduct. Now we'll talk about the roof and the floor. So if you see here in this figure only, the roof is formed by body of the fornix. This is the tela choroidi, and below tela choroidi there is a choroidal plexus projecting downwards from the roof, and the undersurface of the stella choroidi is lined by ependyma, the neuroglial cells. The floor of the third ventricle is formed by various structures like the optic chiasma, tuber cinerarium. So tuber cinerarium is basically, it is a prominence, it is a medial prominence which is formed due to the bulging of the floor of the third ventricle. So basically tuber cinerarium, which is a eminence, inferior distension of the floor of the third ventricle, it is seen on the inferior surface on the base of the brain. It is a hollow distension of the infundibulum, and this distension is caused because of the floor of the third ventricle. Then it is formed by the infundibulum. You can see here the mammillary bodies. Mammillary bodies are basically these are small round bodies which are located on the undersurface of the brain, part of the diencephalon, part of the limbic system, and they are located immediately beneath the medial temporal lobe. Primarily, they are part of the forebrain. Then the posterior perforated substance and the tegmentum of the midbrain. This is the tegmentum of the midbrain. The posterior perforated substance is not seen here in the figure, but it is a gray matter layer, and the perforations are because of the various blood vessels that pierce it They cause formation of small apertures for the transmission of blood vessels. The apertures, small apertures are formed. So for the floor, there is optic chiasma, there is infundibulum, there is tuber cinereum, there are mammillary bodies, there is a tegmentum of midbrain and the posterior perforated substance. Now other boundaries are the lateral wall. So the lateral wall of the third ventricle is formed by the thalamus. That is the medial surface of the thalamus. The medial surface and the posterior superior part. Then another structure in the lateral wall is the hypothalamic sulcus, which is this. This is the hypothalamic sulcus here. It separates the thalamus from the hypothalamus and it extends from the interventricular foramen of Monro to the cerebral aqueduct. This is the extent of the hypothalamic sulcus. And lateral wall is also bounded by the hypothalamus, that is the medial surface of the hypothalamus, and it bounds the anterior inferior part of the cavity. After the boundaries, this figure also shows the different structures that participate in the formation of the various boundaries of the third ventricle. Now the clinical conditions is, because it is a narrow space and already it is a narrow space, and if there are some foreign bodies like especially brain tumors or some developmental defects, then the space can become obstructed, and this would lead to two different conditions. In adults, there would be a raised intracranial pressure because the CSF flow would be obstructed, leading to symptoms like vomiting, headache, papilloedema, nausea. Papilloedema is condition related with the compression of the optic nerve, where there are visual disturbances. And in infants, there is hydrocephalus. Also, if the tumor is located in the lower part, then the structure, a very important structure present there, is the hypothalamus. So there would be symptoms related to the dysfunction of the hypothalamus. So they are known as hypothalamic symptoms, like diabetes insipidus, obesity, sexual disturbances, sleep disturbances, hyperglycemia, and glycosuria. So these are basically in if the hypothalamus functions normally, it regulates all these things. It regulates the sleep and wakefulness cycle. It regulates the secretion of various gonadotropic hormones, plays role in the development of secondary sexual characters. It regulates various neuroendocrinal functions. So if there are any compression in this area due to tumors, then these symptoms can be produced. So that's all about the anatomy of the third ventricle. Thank you so much.